President Trump threatened to cut federal funding to schools in California, tweeting Sunday the Department of Education was investigating allegations that the state would incorporate the 1619 Project into its curriculum.
During a news conference to mark the opening day of remote learning at Chicago Public Schools, Mayor Lori Lightfoot responded to Trump's remarks, saying that the president has no power to try to take funding from any school district, and that if he does, she would see him in court. Talks of defunding from the administration come on the heels of Trump's ban on race-related federal agency trainings. Friend of the show, journalist Zaid Jilani, is here to weigh in on all of this. Zaid, great to see you.
Good to see you, Zaid.
Can you just break down a little bit of the origins of this controversy and the way that President Trump is playing into this and the reality of the power that he may have in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's two different things. So I think, one, he had kind of signed this memorandum looking at the trainings that the federal government is using. So right now, the federal government, various agencies require employees to go through certain trainings as part of workplace development, workforce development. I think that order is probably more on the side of something that he can do, because the federal government obviously controls what it asks its own employees to do. Right now, they're being forced to sit through a lot of trainings, which I think don't have a lot of merit. They haven't really been measured or adjusted based on whether or not they're effective. And I think Christopher Rufo, who is the guy who did the Freedom of Information Act requests on these trainings, he found some fairly ridiculous things they were doing. So I think there is some justification for deeply analyzing those, making sure the trainings we're doing are at least somewhat effective, or at least are not promoting ideas that like objectivity is a white trade or hard work is a white trade, as Smithsonian was found to have promoted in some of its education curriculum. That being said, I think what was being done with the 1619 Project is probably a bit of an overreach. Local school districts have a right to teach their curriculum as they see fit. Local and state actors are generally the people who do this. The federal government can make recommendations. They did this with the Common Core curriculum in concert with a number of other people. But they can't actually dictate the content of state and local curriculum. They never really have done that. Anytime they've tried to do that, it's ended up just being a real mess, a lot of controversy, like in the early 1990s with Lynn Cheney, who was Dick Cheney's wife was really into this issue.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that, I'm not a huge fan of the 1619 Project. I think it's more polemic than history. But it may even have some merit to present as an alternative view, to show some op-eds, so on and so forth. And I don't think the federal government really should be making those decisions for localities. But I do think what they did with the federal workforce training was probably justified. The trainings in particular that they were talking about, they weren't talking about prohibiting all kinds of diversity or sensitivity training. They were really talking about the critical race theory ones, which really are a batch of them promoted by people like Robin DiAngelo, which really just haven't been shown to have any merit. They tend to divide people more. They tend to try to guilt or shame people based on their race. That really hasn't been shown to work. In fact, most diversity trainings don't really work, even the ones that are, I think, a little bit more rooted in science, because you really can't do this in like a get rich quick or lose 100 pounds in 6 weeks type of way. Like a training is more like kind of a CYA thing that a business or a government agency does to say they check the box, we did it. But it doesn't really have long-lasting effects. You really need to have a system in place of mediation, of intergroup contact, perspective taking and giving, have a really good workplace culture that you need to develop over time. Typically, 1 or 2 day trainings, they won't do that much for your workplace culture. And unfortunately, This has been a booming industry right now. People are making a lot of money promoting the idea that they do. But there's a really good article called Why Diversity Programs Fail in Harvard Business Review that reviews a bunch of them and shows that they just generally don't work. So, I'm not mourning the loss of some of these that are on the more extreme end. The ones that are not on the more extreme end are not going to be prohibited. But they just don't tend to be that effective past a few days, is what the research shows.
Right. So, Zaid, let's actually dig into the specifics on the critical race stuff, because I think it's very, very important to actually understand physically what is happening in the mechanics of a so-called training. One of the ones that you referenced there was from Christopher Rufo, which was revealed, I believe, at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. So this is the premier nuclear research facility of the United States government, which is enacting some of these trainings. What were the types of things that they were made to go through at this facility?
Yeah, so Christopher Rufo did a series of Freedom of Information Act requests where basically he went through different agencies and he looked at the consultants they were hiring to do these trainings. And some of the things they did, for instance, is they had white employees write apologies to non-white employees, not about anything in specific that they did, but more about like this larger idea that being white means that you're racist. It means if you're non-white, you also have certain qualities. There are other trainings they offered that describe things like, objectivity, individualism, hard work, being on time as white qualities. Basically, this was the gamut of things you might see in fringe corners of academia, but they were presented in a context of if we give this to the white people in these agencies, they will start treating non-white people better. The reality is when people have studied not these particular diversity trainers, these are fairly new, but the older ones, what they found is that shame and guilt tend to backfire. There was even one experiment I remember where they tested a couple different approaches. One was a positive approach, like what are the positive aspects of diversity to entice people? What are and then the other one was like shame and guilt. What they found was that people actually became a little bit more biased after getting the training if it was based on shame and guilt than if they didn't have the training at all. So the training was actually on net bad for people. Now these newer ones, I don't think anyone's ever really evaluated them. I think Robin DiAngelo makes the argument that if you do push back on any of this, you yourself are fragile. It's the white fragility thing, right? Like if you even try to ask if this works or not, you're fragile. So the ideas being presented in these are not like treat everyone equally, try to get along, accept other cultures, embrace diversity. That's pretty non-controversial, but like I said, it doesn't tend to have a long-lasting effect because you can't really achieve that in 1 or 2 days. You have to just promote an ongoing work environment that promotes those things. But the ideas that are being presented that were so controversial that Rufo found, they're largely about basically demonizing certain racial groups, attaching essential characteristics to other racial groups. They're what you might get in like a critical theory class in college or something like that. But from my knowledge, they've never been applied successfully in an actual workplace context or organizational context to actually change people's minds, right? Often if you're presenting someone, if you're going to white employees and you're just telling them they're terrible, a lot of them will just feel very resentful, right? They might end up treating people worse, or they might end up just withdrawing from the situation at all. If you have this idea that everything you're doing is wrong, you might just not want to associate with non-white employees. You might not want to hire them. You might want to, it really backfires in a lot of cases is I think the threat. So what I would prefer is that they did not use those types of trainings. And I think we have to remember the federal government also pays for all these. So it's also we had to pay for a bunch of trainings and workshops that had no proven effect and sometimes can backfire. That's why I generally would side with the administration on that, as opposed to what they're doing with 1619, which I think is a bit of an overreach to try to dictate what local school districts can do. I mean, it's their choice. So.
Well, it's also an irony because most of the backlash from the federal government, oftentimes, trying to impose something on local school districts comes from the right, comes from conservatives who make exactly the argument that you are, that whoa, this is up to the local school board. We'll figure out what we're going to teach to our kids. Thank you very much. Has there been any of that reaction from the right? And can you also just talk about, because I don't want to ignore the political context in which these, reforms are being offered by President Trump here as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not clear what the political context is, because I think really this happened because Christopher Rufo went on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox News, did a series of segments on this, and then he just said Trump can just ban these if he wants to. So it could have just been a whim on Trump's part that Trump loves this TV show. He got convinced by Rufo's segment. It could be outside of political context, but I think the political context also would be this, that I think that there is definitely a group of white conservatives who are already resentful, right? They already feel anti-white attitudes are normalized in society. Liberals don't like white people. America's getting browner, more diverse. They already have a little bit of a victim complex like that. And so when you throw this stuff on top of it, I think it validates that victim complex, because it's the federal government is literally doing trainings where it's forcing employees to write apologies for things they didn't do, if they happen to be white. This validates that victim complex that existed for decades, probably since the Civil Rights Act, which is another reason why they shouldn't be doing these, right? You don't want to validate these racialist concerns. You don't want to validate resentment, right? You want people to feel like they should be kind towards other people, that they should be accepting towards other cultures, because it's the right thing to do, because other people deserve it, not because they themselves have some kind of shame or guilt when they haven't really done anything wrong. That's generally how you build that resentment. And I think that if there is any political angle, Trump is playing on that resentment But that angle was opened up for him by having this kind of ideology in the first place, right? Which is promoted by corners of the left, right? Like they're giving him the opportunity to do this. And the 1619 Project, we've talked about that. Like, I'm not a big fan of it. It had a lot of inaccuracies. It's that entire angle of attack has been opened up by having kind of a curriculum that is focused on a version of American history that's very distorted, but it opens up that opportunity for someone like Trump to step in and say, they're dismantling American history, they're demonizing our country, blah, blah, blah. Stuff which has been in the conservative canon for decades. Like, this has been their argument against everyone from like Howard Zinn back in the 1970s to the more contemporary kind of revisionist historians today. So I think that, the political context is that there is this like strong white resentment on portions of the right. They're constantly looking for things to validate that. The less and less there is to validate that, the less strong it is. But the more an ideology is pushed out there that actually does kind of demonize white folks, that it actually does kind of play on shame and guilt, a collective shame and guilt of the country even, I think it would validate their concerns and make them feel stronger, make them feel more resentful. And you have to remember, I think in 50 or 60 years, whites will be a minority in this country, right? That will further escalate a lot of tension if we don't manage this the right way, if we don't build like a durable type of multiculturalism rather than one based on like resentment or based on sectarianism or division. So
I think that's a really important point.
Very important point.
Zed, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Ed.
Still to come as the Senate prepares to vote on a skinny bill, many are asking how this will directly impact everyday workers. The president of the Transportation Workers Union, John Samuelson, is going to weigh in on that when Rising returns.